Canada's Senate is now in the second reading of Bill C-16. That's the federal bill that aims to make it illegal to discriminate against people based on their gender identity or their gender expression. It's the bill that made Jordan B. Peterson, the professor at U of T, very famous because he said he didn't want the government compelling his speech to use made-up pronouns. Well, right now, as the Senate is amid its second reading of the bill, it's hearing from various witnesses for and against the bill. One of those witnesses was Saad, a professor at Concordia University and a very well-known YouTuber. I sat down with him for an extended conversation. Hope you enjoy.
The general populace is aware of how serious this issue is, and they don't fall in line with, the guys who are pushing Bill C-16. So I think even if the bill were to be passed, it was really important for this to be archived in the records. And so even if it is lost, in a sense, it's not lost.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit more about the science stuff before we move forward into more of the politics and the law and the effects even on university campuses, because for all we know, this conversation that we're about to have is going to be illegal down the road. And so I'm wondering, could you give us specific examples of the sorts of stuff that you want to talk about in a university lecture that would be forbidden if C-16 is passed?
So, of course, when I tried to make that point, many of the lobotomized senators scoffed and laughed and rolled their eyes. But of course, they had no response to my concerns, right? So I'm not suggesting that it is guaranteed that it will become illegal, but a sensitive transgender student who would take offense could then potentially, file a complaint against me under Bill C-16. So example, I walk into class and I explain how sex differences arise. I talk about differences in mating behavior between men and women. I talk about differences in consumatory behavior, because what I do in my research is I link evolutionary biology to consumer behavior. And throughout my course, I constantly refer to men and women. And at no point do I necessarily discuss the transgendered and the pan-queer and the two-spirited and the non-gendered and the non-binary. So someone could come along and say, well, in your course, you did not in any way address the multiplicity of personhoods that exist out there, including mine, which is pan-queer, non-gendered,
made-up jargon, let's be honest.
The acronym is. And therefore, you are exhibiting, even though you don't mean to be a mean guy, Professor, you are exhibiting this antiquated, fixed binaries and biological essentialism. If you remember, during my Senate testimony, I repeatedly mentioned those words because those were words that were used at Harvard University, where they argued that it is transphobic systemic violence. Those are the exact words. It is systemic violence to provide misinformation, in quotes, that says that, humans have fixed binaries, meaning male, female, and that there is such a thing as biology. That's biological essentialism. So how could I teach an evolutionary biology course? How could I teach an evolutionary psychology course where from the get-go that would be considered systemic violence? And of course, the senators had no answer to that. They simply scoffed and laughed mockingly. So the fix is in.
And this is the thing. So you say gender is binary, i.e. there are only two genders?
So, here's the way that I would explain this. Let me draw an analogy.
Let's do it.
If I were to say humans are a sexually reproducing species, that is an absolute fact.
Yes, that's the only way we've been able to evolve and stay alive.
Sorry?
It's the only way we've been able to evolve and stay alive. You know that much better than myself.
Right. Now, there are people who are celibate. There are people who are asexual, meaning they feel no sexual attraction to anybody. There are people who engage in what's called object sexuality. They fall in love and wish to have sex with their car. Right?
Objectophilia. Now, yes, I've Wikipedia'd this once upon a time.
So even though all of those other sexual expressions exist, right? Nobody is denying that the human tapestry is quite rich in its heterogeneity, but the default values, the default phenotypes are that you need a male and a female to sexually reproduce, right? It doesn't take a fancy evolutionary psychologist to understand that. So the same principle applies when we discuss gender and all this, is it biological sex or not? Yes, of course there are transgendered people. Yes, of course, there are intersex people. And yes, of course, they deserve all of the legal rights and protections that anybody else has. But that doesn't mean that in a evolutionary psychology course, I'm going to talk about the multiplicity of genders, all of which are default values. That's simply scientifically false. It's ridiculous.
Am I correct in saying that even if someone gets a sex change, it doesn't change their actual biology? Like, they're still XX or XY, correct? Just because they've changed their genitalia, it doesn't actually change their biology, making them,
it doesn't change their
women.
genome, of course. And of course, in many, take for example David Reimer, which is an example that I discussed after my testimony. I gave a parliamentary lecture on Wednesday where I talked about death of the West by 1,000 cuts. And at one point, I was talking about something called social constructivism. So social constructivism is the idea that we're all born with empty minds, and it's only socialization that make us who we are. So Faith Goldy is feminine in her demeanor, and Saad is masculine in his, simply because I learned to play with the trucks aggressively, and you learned to play with nurturance with dolls, and that started a cascade of socialization. Well, David Reimer was a very famous clinical case where during a botched circumcision, there was damage to his penis so that he could no longer be a functional, reproductively viable male. And so they took him to a psychologist at Johns Hopkins University by the name of John Money, who was one of those guys who argued, look, gender is a social construction. Just put a dress on him, call him Linda, and raise him as a girl, and voila, he'll be a girl. Well, guess what happened to David Reimer? He committed suicide.
Yeah, of course.
So again, these come from faulty understandings of human nature. They come from ideological positions, and this is what is an affront to me. It's the injury to truth that upsets me.
And I think that you touch on such an important part of the truth that we will, I'm afraid, we run a risk of hiding, and that is the fact that suicide within the transgender community, I mean, we're talking about 1 in 9, I believe was the last statistic that I saw. A lot of these people suffer from gender dysphoria. A lot of these people have mental illness. And I worry that me saying that in C16 Canada will label me a bigot. And should I be called to a human rights tribunal where there is a presumption of guilt as opposed to a liberal democratic value of the presumption of innocence, I will be fined, and hell, if I don't pay for it, jailed, just because I pointed out the fact that actually I don't want these people to commit suicide. I want them to go seek, psychiatric help, as opposed to being called Z and Zer and still dying on the inside, possibly trying to take their own life. As a scientist, as a professor, do you worry that we will indeed be putting more transgendered people with gender dysphoria, in harm's way as opposed to helping them? Like, this is just a giant virtue signaling endeavor in which we're actually going to hurt the people we seek to help.
It's difficult for me to predict how the epidemiology of suicide will change, if at all, as a result of the passing and the enacting of this bill. But I could tell you this: the idea that because the transgendered suffer high suicide rates, that ergo this must imply that they are nefarious forces, for example, greater bullying, and therefore we need to find a way to protect them. At least as far as I know, although I'm not an expert on that particular literature, as far as I know, that causality has not been established.
It's correlation, it's not causation, 100%.
I'm sorry?
It's correlation, not causation.
If at that,
chubby kids,
sure
I was
a correlation. So let me give you an example.
Yeah, go for it.
Men around the world commit suicide 3 times more than women. Right? So if you take global epidemiological data of suicide and compare men to women, men are 3 times more likely, actually successfully commit suicide 3 times more than women. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that there is an evil matriarchy that is to blame for men's greater suicide and that we need to then protect men. Men have to become a protected class. There might be very compelling and important reasons that are not necessarily nefarious that might explain why these men are more likely to commit suicide. So again, the idea that because the transgendered commit suicide, therefore we must have more protection from them, I don't think is borne out by science.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I worry about also is the fact that this is going to have repercussions within the family unit, where we're going to have we're going to make it illegal to question transgenderism to the point where people within the academic, scientific, and medical community are going to be hushed from saying things like, hey, maybe giving hormone blockers to your kids is a bad idea, which is right now, I believe, where the American Pediatric Society stands. Do you mind if I just share a quote with you? Because this is from the American College of Pediatricians. Conditioning children into believing that a lifetime of chemical and surgical impersonation of the opposite sex is normal and healthful is child abuse. Endorsing gender discordance as normal via public education and legal policies will confuse children and parents, leading more children to present themselves to gender clinics where they will be given puberty-blocking drugs. This, in turn, virtually ensures that they will choose a lifetime of carcinogenic and otherwise toxic cross-sex hormones and likely consider unnecessary surgical mutilation of their healthy bodies as young adults. And again, the reason why I wanted to talk to you is because the science part of it is to me what's the most compelling, and to see these social justice warriors and these raging fanatics on the left who once upon a time clung so desperately to science and her gospel as opposed to, God's gospel, now turn their back on science. To the point of just delusion, I worry that kids, suicidal people are going to be, at the end of the day, hurt by this. It's just absolutely nuts. Now I want to pivot a little bit now to the university kind of atmosphere. Universities are already so screwed, God. Like, they're already so, again, you know this better than I do.
You're preaching to the choir.
Yeah. How do you think that we're, first of all, going to see more people using this almost, like, if I were a kid, honestly, I was a bit of a prankster. I was a bit of a disturber of sorts. I would use this just to tick my teachers off, to be honest. Be like, actually, I'm G right now. 10 minutes later, I'm he. But do you think that this is going to put a chill on freedom of speech in campuses? And what does that mean, not just for the student body, but for professors as well?
Look, every single day, the stifling environment becomes worse in universities, right? Because there is yet another group that comes out that says, you better not offend me. Because the highest ideal now at a university is not the pursuit of truth. That should be the highest ideal. That should be the apex ideal that we strive for. The current ideal is, do not offend someone, and certainly not one who is the fad group in the Oppression Olympics. And so what ends up happening, people feel very stifled in their ability to have open discussions, right? I've mentioned this before, but it's worth mentioning again. I have shared, for example, at the Manning Conference in February, first-person testimonies of people who wrote to me, whether it be students or professors or parents of students, just sharing with me their stories of how terrified they are to open their mouth about anything, whether it be about abortion or about Islam or about transgender or about feminism or about anything, right? All of the exciting stuff that we should be discussing, where reasonable people could fall on either side of an issue, while people know very quickly what is the politically correct position to take. And if they don't truly fall in that camp, then they take the decision, the regrettable decision, to self-censor. Is that really what we want in our universities? And so really my testimony was, a few days ago, was really to warn against that. And by the way, note that never mind the fact that you might be transgressing Bill C-16 later down the road, even during the testimony when the bill wasn't passed, one of the senators accused me of being pro-genocide.
I'm so happy you brought this up. I wanted to bring this up. So it's a liberal senator, and he says that he cannot, in good conscience, vote against C-16 as you've asked him to, because what C-16 aims to do is to stop the genocide of transgender. So I think, first of all, the senator is a little bit confused just when it comes to definitions of suicide versus genocide. There is not some sort of state-sanctioned cull of transgenders that's occurring anywhere in the West that I know of. So let alone in Canada, right? This is a group which, let's be very, very frank, is given an inordinate amount of political power, given their small percentage, they're a fraction of 1% of society, right? This is the same group where Obama, with the stroke of his pen in 2016, said, let all public bathrooms in public schools be transgender. Just because you say you're a man, well, now you can go into the girls' bathroom, right? They wield an enormous amount of political control, but instead what this liberal senators seemed to suggest was that genocide was going on. That to me shows me just how delusional and fanatical these people are when it comes to just the ideology that, not the science, but the ideology that informs the theory that's behind this. And I want to talk about the theory, because while you were in front of the Senate, you said no longer, and I'm paraphrasing here, so feel free to correct me, no longer is it I think therefore I am, the famous Descartes quote, but it's I'm a victim and therefore I am. And I thought, wow, that is just so poignant, because in today's era and ethos of identity politics, you got even deeper. It's not just about my identity, it's about the victimhood that is baked into my identity. And of course, what this is, what C16 bloody well is just, it's cultural Marxism and postmodernism on paper, this critical theory doctrine of divide and conquer, put everyone into their identity groups, have them all, fancy themselves the oppressors or the oppressed. Why? Because at the end of the day, it's divide and conquer, so to expand the state. And that's exactly what we're seeing happen right here. We're dividing them up. We're focusing on a fraction of 1% of the society. We're putting good and well-meaning and commonsensical people in universities, in their homes, in workplaces, on YouTube as well. We're dividing them all up. And at the end of the day, what happens? The government has been giving itself the ability to command the words within your mouth. Like this is cultural Marxism. And I wanted to commend you on that phrase, I am a victim, therefore I am, because I thought it was just, boy, that is 2017.
Thank you. I don't know if you then noticed I think it was the next sentence where I said, and I refer to this condition as collective Munchausen.
Right.
Now,
right.
I'm not sure. Are you familiar? This is a term that I coined a while ago. I think Ezra Levant really appreciated, so much so that he invited me on the show.
Viewers.
Are you familiar with this concept?
Yes. Please explain it.
So, Munchausen syndrome is an actual psychiatric disorder whereby someone will feign an illness so that they could then garner the sympathy and empathy from people around them. It could be family members. It could be the medical, professionals. Oh, poor you, what's wrong with you? Let's work on you, right? Munchausen syndrome by proxy is where, for example, a biological mother who has a young her biological child under her care will harm the child so that she could then take him to the medical establishment and people could fawn over her because she is the mother of a sick child. And so this is why it's called Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Mm-hmm. And so I took this set of psychiatric conditions, which I had actually written a scientific paper about in a medical journal, and I then thought that what we're seeing in terms of the zeitgeist of society is a collective Munchausen. So the way that I get my ego strokes, if I am one who constantly cries victimhood, is that I am then getting the attention in the same way that the woman who feigns illness to get attention is exactly getting those ego strokes. Well, now I'm going to use the language of social justice warriors to demonstrate how much I've suffered. I am a overweight, brown guy. I am short. Please help me, right? And collective Munchausen by proxy is where the liberal senators who were scoffing at me are now using other groups as their little victim groups that they are now coming and saving. You see? So it's really taking a psychiatric condition that already exists and demonstrating that the lunacy that we're seeing is just a manifestation of this at the collective level.
But really what it is at its core, while they might think that they're a bunch of do-getters, I don't think that every liberal senator is a maniacal neo-Marxist, with a very clear war path. I think a lot of them are do-gooders and they think that they are helping. But embedded within that is this bigotry of low expectations where the transgender man or woman cannot save a bill, cannot do well in society, function in society, obtain a job unless there is in black and white legislation that allows them to be referred to by made-up pronouns. I think that this will backfire. If I were an employer right now, and I know that this is going to come out sounding bigoted, but I'm not going to want any transgenders working for me because I do not want to have a word police around me constantly. And so I'm not going to put down, I'm not hiring you because X, Y, Z, but inside it's going to create a sort of, I don't want to say bigotry, but it's fear and it's a paralysis where I just don't want to be around you. I don't want to have that sort of thing in my office, in my workspace, where everyone's going to have to constantly be policing their words. I just want to be around people who are he's and she's, and it correlates to what my eyes are ascertaining here. Do you think I'm onto something or no?
No, absolutely. By the way, a similar phenomenon happens with Islam right now, right? Where a lot of people, regrettably, will make the decision, well, should I hire this person or not? Because what happens down the road when they now insist on the hijab and the 5 times prayer and this and that, right? So by, in a sense, not being, it's a different example, but it's explaining something quite similar to what you're saying. By you not wishing to assimilate and be and treated in exactly the same way as everybody else, by you wanting that special status, it actually causes people who otherwise are perfectly non-bigoted to recoil from interacting with you because they know that there will be trouble down the line. And I think that's what Theron was saying quite eloquently and convincingly at one point, where she said, look, I don't want to be treated differently from anybody else. You're patronizing me by doing so. I'm no different than anybody else. Give me the exact same rights and privileges as everybody else. And I thought, boy, she's sharp. She gets it. I wanted to mention just one other very quick thing.
Please.
During my opening remarks, I also referred to, if you remember, the tyranny of the minority, right?
That's what this is.
I'm sorry?
That's what this is, 100%.
Exactly. So if you think about the idea that now there are all sorts of, mechanisms whereby the government is very proudly saying that they're moving towards a gender-neutral society. So, for example, in various official communiques with the government, let's say on a passport, they're going to remove the biological markers male-female because what happens if I am a non-gendered or non-binary person? Then you are inconveniencing me. You're triggering me, to use this obnoxious term, by forcing me to adhere to this fixed binaries, right? Now, the reality is that substantially more than 99% of the population, in the order of 99.9, and we can argue about how many decimal points we have to go. Yeah, that's right. Of the population,
9.9, exactly,
are perfectly aligned in terms of their identities and their biological sex, and very much identify as an integral part of their personhood that they are males and females. So let me state very clearly, I am male and I'd like to be known as that. And I'm married to another person called a woman. And we have 2 children. They're called boy and girl. Now, I should have all those personhoods erased because 0.01% of the people might be inconvenienced. Hey, they deserve every protection, but they don't deserve to have my personhood erased because they might be inconvenienced. Hence, that's the tyranny of the minority.
I think that this madness is deliberate. I think that we are trying to make sense of something when it was designed to erase the sense, to erase the common sense. And again, it gets back to for me at least, these are the children of postmodernism that designed this legislation. For them, there's no such thing as reason and logic. When I see, you look at the human eyeball, it's designed to see. There's intentionality, there's purpose to it, right? You look at the human race, man and woman, there's purpose, and it is to procreate and be together. And transgenderism in and of itself, I think, erases a lot of that. And I know that's going to sound bigoted to a lot of people out there, but I should be free to say that sort of thing the same way that you can criticize my religion. And, at the end of the day, we can still have a beer together. But I think that this legislation is meant to heighten
moral relativism, to heighten all sorts of relativism, and to get you away from the normative and bring you into, again, deliberate madness. I don't know where we go from here, but I do know, to Theron's earlier point and to your point, we are now creating these beasts. We are now empowering these minority groups that are going to be wielding an even more inordinate amount of political control, making even more outrageous demands. I read a piece today in our state broadcaster here, the CBC, of a women's shelter. I believe it was out in BC. And these women said, we don't want transgender people coming here. It's not good for the women that are here. These are all women, biological women. They want to be in a, you want to talk about safe spaces? These women need it more than anyone, right? They've come out of abusive relationships, and they don't want anyone with man parts hanging around inside the walls. Can't we just respect them enough to say, you know what, the majority of women here, 100% of the people here being women, we're not going to inconvenience you for one person who wants to be here. And if you want to come up with a transgender homeless shelter, something, power to you. And goodness knows you'll probably get a government grant too, never mind leaving it all up to the private sector, right? But why should a women's shelter be forced to bring the transgenders in because of C-16 now all of a sudden? It's a total tyranny of the minority, but these absurd demands are only going to continue because, well, hell, we're enshrining it in law.
And look, the background to all of this, and this is all going to be part of my next book, sort of the forces that have led to the lunacy that we're facing. The background to this, I mean, there are several forces, but one of which we have briefly touched upon is postmodernism. Look, postmodernism is intellectual terrorism, right?
Yes.
In other words, it is anti-science. By
yes.
definition, that's how it defines itself. It has no epistemology. It has no philosophy of knowledge. It is anti-knowledge. It is anti-common sense. That's how it defines itself. So let me just give you one quick example. Approximately 14, 15 years ago, I sat down with a radical feminist who was a postmodernist, and we started getting into a discussion as to whether human universals exist or not. Now, of course, as a evolutionary scientist, of course, I recognize that human universals exist. Otherwise, what does it mean to have a human nature, right? She said, no, absolutely not. There is no such thing as human universals. So then I said, well, do you mind if I propose what I consider to be a human universal, and you tell me why you think it's not? She said, yes, absolutely. I said, well, within Homo sapiens, within humans, only women can bear children. Is that not a human universal? She looked at me, scoffed, and laughed like those buffoonish senators during my testimony, and said, absolutely not. You're disgusting. Well, what do you mean? Why is that? She said, well, because there's a Japanese tribe on some island off Japanese mainland, where in the spiritual realm, in the narrative of their spiritual realm, it is the men who bear children. So by you restricting the discussion of childbearing to the materialistic biological realm, that's how you keep us barefoot and pregnant. So this woman, who was a graduate student, I think at McGill University, was not willing to concede that only women can bear children. So if I'm having that conversation with her 14 years ago, I could have predicted very quickly for you what the eventual trajectory was going to be, and it was that I would have to testify 2 days ago in front of those buffoonish senators.
I sometimes contemplate whether or not George Orwell was a prophet with his canon text, 1984. Newspeak, in 1984, the text, is Canadian legislation 2017, to the point where we have to have these conversations where we are radically and like quite seriously and intensely and rigorously questioning something as simple as it's just women who can have babies. Like, this is when you've become so lofty and esoteric in your university, glass house and ivory tower, that you just need to come back down to earth, honey, okay? Realize, okay, you're a man, I'm a woman, I can carry children, you can't, you know what I mean? And if you want to call yourself something else, well, guess what? It's a liberal democracy. You have so much freedom in this country. You go ahead. But you can't make me call you that. And if you want to call me a man as opposed to a woman, you're free to, I know you're wrong, but I'm not going to go ahead and compel words into your mouth. month. It is so insane that not only has Newspeak come into Canada, but we've now got Big Brother shoving the words down our mouth. We got to have you on another time to talk M103, because I know that you're a religious refugee. Am I correct? From Lebanon,
yes, so
essentially.
we're Lebanese Jews, and we escaped the Lebanese civil war in the mid-70s, yes.
I would love to have you on another time to talk about M103. It's one of my kind of passions. This is something that I've been watching, and I should say some lip service, because I'll probably hear about it in the comments. In Ontario, we have something called Bill 89, which is this on steroids, where if parents do not refer to their children by the same gender identity and gender expression that their children choose, okay, these are people who are not allowed to serve in the military, to buy cigarettes, to drink booze, to drive a car, but they can pick, that they no longer like their genitalia and they're going to be a girl today. If the parents do not acquiesce and say, yes, little Tommy at 8 years old, I'll call you a she now, that child services, protective services come in there and take your kid away.
Goodness.
Bill
Oh,
89,
boy.
that's what you got to look into, okay? Kathleen wins Ontario. This is the dystopia. This is the Great White North. It's, take me, Trump's America. It's become too crazy here. God, I really...
We're desperately trying to get to be similar to Sweden, aren't we?
Yeah, we have a cultural suicide death wish. We have a cultural masochism that is being played out in live time and collectively and a mass scale, and it is so disgusting because our federal government is welcoming in Sharia creep in M103 and thou shalt not offend the prophet, while at the same time saying you got to use je and jure, and I wonder what Muhammad would have said about transgenders.
Well,
I think we probably
we'll leave it
would
for next time.
Yeah, okay, done. Thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure. Cheers.
All right, and thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed that video, hit like below and subscribe to our YouTube channel.